Okay, so the game I had planned for today's episode turned out to have serious speed issues trying to get it running emulated, and because I was sick again for a couple days, I ran out of time to get it working right while still being able to get the episode out on time. So instead, I went through my backlog of stuff to look for something nice and quick to cover, and remembered I had today's ancient DOS game hidden away on the Interplay 10-year anthology collection, known simply as Battle Chess. Now, given that we're taking a look at a chess game, and given that chess is pretty much the great-great-grandfather of all strategy games, and given that I suck at strategy games, this provides me a good opportunity to explain why my skill at strategy games is often extremely poor, and it comes down to the way I like to experiment and play in unexpected ways. Since I'm not good at reading ahead and strategizing, my best way to win a strategy game of any kind is by confusing my opponents, typically by making moves or performing actions which are unexpected and make it look as though I'm planning much further ahead than I actually am. To that end, when it comes to chess, against everyday people who don't play chess on a regular basis, I have about a 50-50 win ratio. And that's because the average person is incapable of reading the entire chessboard and planning enough moves ahead to understand why I'm making the moves I am making. My unorthodox play becomes a distraction, which makes it possible for me to win. But computers don't have this extremely human failing. Even a computer opponent on its lowest skill setting will be able to read the entire chessboard and make the most optimal move for the moment, even if it's not looking ahead at all. This means I cannot confuse computer opponents, which means my tactics are useless, which means when it comes to chess, my win ratio against computer AI on very low settings is about 1 in 10. Yeah, it's completely pathetic. Well, at least with this particular game, the entire selling point was the graphics. Every piece on the board is animated, and when one piece takes another, or when the king is put into checkmate, an animation plays out to show how the piece accomplished what it did. This means there's unique animations in place for every kind of piece taking every kind of piece, making this game more of a spectacle than a typical chess match would be, while still retaining a competent AI and including a couple additional features as well. Battle Chess was originally developed by Interplay for Amiga computers and published through Electronic Arts in 1988. However, the DOS port came out a year later in 1989 and was published by Interplay themselves. It's effectively a 0 to 2 player strategy game, as you'd expect. Now, one thing that's very important to keep in mind is that there's technically 2 releases of the game. The original release, which supports CGA 4-color, Tandy 16-color, and EGA 16-color graphics, as well as composite CGA output, all running at 320 by 200 resolution, along with both PC speaker and Tandy 3 voice sound, as well as an updated release which only supports VGA 320 by 200 256 color graphics and PC speaker sound. And it's actually incredibly difficult to tell these 2 releases apart. If you have a photo of the actual box or discs, here's how you can tell. For the box, the system requirements sticker is in the bottom corner, and if it says that VGA and MCJ are supported in 16 colors, it's the original release. Whereas if it does not mention the color depth, it will either be a release containing both versions of the game or just the VGA version. As for the discs, if the disc says VGA required, or if you got it from a CD, it'll be the VGA release. Otherwise, it'll be the original release. I should also point out that the PC speaker and Tandy 3 voice support both produce digitized output with this game, which I'm sure sounds fine on real hardware, but I did notice that DOSBox can't properly emulate the Tandy 3 voice being used as a DAC, so playing the game that way sounds very wrong. But the digitized PC speaker output works fine regardless. As for its current release state, it's still commercial but extremely easy to acquire copies of, as you not only have digital options, but physical copies aren't even remotely rare. However, there's some things to keep in mind on all fronts. For digital copies, you can either go with GOG or Steam, and either way it's $10. But with the GOG release, you don't have any DRM, whereas with the Steam release, you also get an enhanced version as well as the base game, if that's something you care about. And in terms of physical copies, you're going to find a whole bunch for sale at any point in time, and they typically go for only a few bucks for loose discs, or around $20 to $30 fully boxed. However, do keep in mind, the game was released on a whole plethora of computers and consoles, so make sure you sort through the listings to find the precise copy you want. And also, this game appeared in multiple collections. Well, I've already mentioned that my copy comes from the Interplay 10-year Anthology collection, but there's other collections out there this game appears in, and many of those collections have similar prices. So really, when it comes down to it, you have a ton of options for grabbing a copy of this game nowadays. I was thinking for a little that I could just skip on describing how chess works because, let's be real, the vast majority of everybody watching this video will know the basic rules of chess. But then I thought back to how my nieces are very much removed from traditional games and realized there might actually be people watching this video now or in the future who have no idea what the rules of chess are. So I'm going to go over the basics very briefly. Chess itself is played on a board consisting of 8x8 spaces, 64 in total, and each player gets 16 pieces to start with. 8 pawns forming a line in front of all other pieces, 2 rooks on the corners, 2 knights beside those, 2 bishops beside those, a queen which goes on its respective tile color at the back, and a king which goes next to the queen. At no moment in time may 2 pieces occupy the same space. If a player moves a piece onto a space occupied by another piece, that piece is captured and taken out of play. The ultimate goal of the game is to put the opponent's king into a state where you would capture it with your next move, which is called check, and if there's no move the opponent can make to save their king from this fate, it is referred to as checkmate and the game is over. However, the strategy is in how the pieces are allowed to move. Pawns can normally only move 1 space forward and can only capture other pieces by moving 1 space diagonally forward, save for a very special rule which doesn't often come into play. However, a pawn which hasn't been moved yet can be elected to move 2 spaces forward instead if possible. Rooks can move any distance they want provided nothing is in the way, but are limited to horizontal and vertical movement. The bishop is the same, but only moves diagonally. The queen has 8 directional movement and is thus incredibly powerful. The king also has 8 directional movement, but can only move 1 space at a time. And the knights, well, they're special. The knights are supposed to be on horseback and thus able to weave through anyone in their way, so their movement is not hampered by other pieces on the board and is always any horizontal or vertical direction by 2 spaces and then an adjacent direction by 1 space. Thus, if you had a knight right here on an empty board, it could move into any of these 8 spaces around it. And that's all the basics. Naturally, there's other rules too, but I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, though I will say that in order for someone to win, they have to put their opponent into checkmate. If a situation arises where an opponent cannot make a move without putting themselves into check or checkmate, this becomes a stalemate, and neither player wins. There's other ways for the game to end in a draw as well, but let's start focusing on this chess program itself. The battle chess uses some interesting colorations for the pieces in order to keep the graphics interesting, with fuchsia for the white side, herein referred to as red by the game, and blue for the black side. The default settings put the game into one-player mode, where the red pieces are player-controlled and the blue pieces are computer-controlled, but this is simple enough to change if you'd rather play the blue pieces, or if you'd want to play 2 players against another opponent locally. Plus there's also a modem play option, which is handled a lot more manually than you might expect. Since this is a very early example of modem-based gaming, all of the dialing and connection details have to be handled manually by the players. Then, once both computers are connected, both players load into a new game, select which side they're playing as, and select their opponent as a modem opponent. And if the 2 computers are talking to each other, they'll link up and sync opponent moves with each other appropriately. Now, you can also set it so that the computer will play against itself, but I have noticed the computer plays incredibly defensive like this. I mean, cripes, look at how ridiculous this board got before one of the computer opponents finally made the first capture. And then a few moves later proceeded to resign to itself with the board looking like this. Yeah, let's talk about the computer skill settings for a moment because it's not entirely clear how they work even after you read the manual. There's 11 settings: Novice, levels 1 through 9, and a special set time mode. The manual describes different settings as the average amount of time it takes the computer to make a move, which seems to double with each skill setting increase. What's actually going on is that the novice setting has the computer only look at the current state of the board, whereas each level up from there has the computer scan 1 or more moves ahead. which is why a setting of level 9 could take the computer well over half an hour to make a move. Well, as far as late 80s and early 90s computers are concerned. However, you also have a set time option. This allows you to define exactly how many minutes to limit the computer's investigation to. The higher you set this, and the faster the computer itself is, the deeper the computer is allowed to analyze the state of the board, looking for optimal moves. Generally speaking though, unless you're an expert at chess, the set time option is worthless, since you have to be playing on level 4 or higher for it to really start making any sort of difference in the computer's thinking time. And at that point, that means the computer's already looking 4 moves ahead. The main draw of this particular game though are the animations. Whenever a capture takes place, the 2 pieces involved will take up positions, with the winning piece always situated at the back looking towards the camera, and the losing piece being up front and facing away. The developers took a bunch of creative liberties with this as well, as the rooks turn into rock monsters, which are able to bash or straight up devour their enemies. The queens use magic to annihilate their foes. The kings use modern day tools like guns and bombs to murder anyone in their way. And the pawns tend to just bumble their way to victory, or use dirty tricks and traps. The knights and the bishops tend to have the more mundane animations, though the knight versus knight fight is made to resemble a particular battle from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, though here in the original game the reference is a little less obvious compared to how this is done in the enhanced version of the game. There's also a 2D view you can enable and even play the game within. However, this disables all of the fun animations and kinda defeats the point of the whole experience. I mean, if you're trying to play faster, then maybe this would help with that, since the animations can definitely be slow to play out, especially with the rooks. Though given the last feature I'm about to touch on, having this 2D mode in place at all was kind of important. You see, the last feature to talk about, which I haven't shown yet, which is actually exceptionally important to have and isn't always present in chess programs, is the ability to define the layout of the board however you want. And there's still certain rules to adhere to, such as having one and only one king present for both players no matter what, but you can otherwise redefine the rest of it however you want. For instance, if you want a whole bunch of knights instead of pawns, you're able to do that and see the chaos which ensues. However, the main reason this is such an important feature is so that you can set up chess problems, puzzles, and mid-game layouts all on your own accord, and then play the game from those states. In fact, the manual for the game includes a surprisingly large list of full game move lists, which, if you play them out first in the board editor, you can then stop at a particular state, go back to proper gameplay, take over one of the sides, and see if you can succeed from that state. Plus, this allowed me to check one thing I was notably curious about. Because this game has to account for every possibility in terms of pieces taking other pieces or mating the king, there's one animation I was very curious to see because it almost never happens in proper chess matches. Placing the opponent's king in checkmate with a pawn. This almost never happens because in order for a pawn to checkmate a king, the pawn has to make its move and then be diagonally next to the opponent's king, meaning the king could take said pawn. However, doing so must somehow be impossible due to the king entering check if they did, plus all other moves the king could make would have to put it in check, and all other moves by any other pieces wouldn't capture the pawn, which just put the king into check. So, I've crafted a logically sound layout of pieces for this situation to transpire, thus let's see the animation for this incredibly unlikely and rare event. Riveting. Overall, Battle Chess is a competent chess program in and of itself, with a decent number of features, but with the added spectacle of fully animated pieces and battles thrown into the mix. When it comes down to it, this is a program intended for people who love chess, but is also approachable by people who don't love chess due to the novelty of watching the various pieces duke it out. At the end of the day, though, it's still ultimately just another chess program, so I would say, unless you like playing chess on a regular basis, there's not really a good reason to invest your money into this one. Yep, just leave cycle set to auto and the game should run perfectly fine, at least from the perspective of playing it back on an older computer. If you want the AI to run its paces faster, then you'll want to set a higher fixed cycles count, but not max. If you set the cycles to max, the AI ends up overloading the emulation and ends up going slower than you would expect. Now, I was actually running the game at a low fixed cycles count without really thinking much of it, as I neglected to set it back after testing the cycle setting out. Whoops. Anywho, that'll be all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games, and that'll be it for ADG videos for the year. Since I had to end things a week late this year, next year will also be starting a week late. Thus, next episode of ADG, episode 337, will be on Saturday, January 11th, 2025. Many thanks again for continuing to join me on this crazy ride through DOS gaming history. Many thanks to everyone supporting me directly on Patreon or indirectly through likes, sharing, reposting, all of that. And here's hoping 2025 will go even better, given that we're going to have a new side series to join the ranks alongside No Nostalgia Retro Gaming come February or March, depending on how long it takes to get it all set up. Until then, I hope you all have an awesome holiday season, and I'll see you all again in a month. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to all the folks shown here supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show directly and see your name here as well, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.